I think it only does 28-minute segments, so maybe after 28 minutes we have to restart.
Okay, I'll do that, I guess. Yours? No.
Yeah.
Oh, then it's okay.
And the mic's on.
Mics are on, but those ones, you have to push a button. Well, the button's off, otherwise it picks up ambient, and then when
so
they
they know.
speak, yeah, it should have. Sam has definitely been in this room for a long time. The other folks, I don't know. All the players have worked on this one. But the other ones, Korea. Oh, this Regina. The only thing is, if one of us sits here, the other person sometimes sits up there in case of the laptop, and then so we have heard that their mics are recorded. So that's something we've done.
Their questions and I'm grabbing them.
Usually we do. That for some reason, there's less people that don't need a mic, so we can hear each other.
Okay.
But I think people like it. People can't hear too well. PowerPoint? Okay.
Yeah. No, yeah, the screen's closed, so I'll just open it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice of them to tell us.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe, yeah. You know, sometimes people fiddle in the little plug falls out. But you can stay here. You can stay here. I don't know. It's not too far away from you.
Okay, I'll probably.
Alright, so this is recording.
Oh, thank you.
Good to go, yeah.
I like it. I'm good.
Tempting to move it into the middle. See, yeah. It's not because his head. Maybe we'll move it in the middle. What if we put it in front of that chair? Let's try that.
Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Henry Hale. I'm professor of political science and international affairs here at the Elliott School's Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, IRES. And on behalf of the program on new approaches to research and security in Eurasia, one of IRES's programs, together with King's College London, the King's Russia Institute there, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I'm very happy to welcome you all to what I think will be a very interesting discussion on understanding political opposition in Russia, sources and structures of authoritarian rule and resistance. I think most of the speakers are, all the speakers are well known, and we are going to go roughly in the following format. So we'll start with Professor Regina Smyth of Indiana University, and then a presentation from a joint project from Sam Greene, director of King's Russia Institute at King's College London, and Graeme Robertson, professor at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And so both those speakers will then present findings from their own research on Russia's opposition. And then we'll have perspectives relating to that research and the general topic from Maria Lipman, who is a expert on Russian politics, now with George Washington University here at IRES, and she's the editor of the new Russian language journal called Counterpoint, or Kontrapunkt, and I'm sure she'd be happy to talk with you about that if you're interested in learning more. The first issue will be officially out, I think, in a few days, maybe a week. And then Boris Grozovsky from the Gaidar Foundation. So I think it should be a very interesting discussion. I won't linger more, and let me turn things over to Regina. We've asked each speaker to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have hopefully plenty of time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank Graeme and Sam. No.
I want to thank Graeme and Sam for organizing this panel and inviting me. I'm going to speak referring to research that I've done since 2011 based on interviews with protesters, rally participants, and not, I'll use my classroom voice, and non-activists. And the follow-up data we've done with focus groups, also interviewing with activists in the Navalny campaign, and then follow-up data subsequently with extended interviews with opposition leaders, and now finally a series of interviews with people who have left Russia following political and economic unrest. So I called my talk, as I began to conceptualize it, the surprising power of weak opposition. So it's very easy to be cynical about the Russian opposition and to label it weak and irrelevant. And if you look at the literature on electoral authoritarianism, often formal models of competition in electoral authoritarianism don't really even acknowledge that there's an organized opposition at all. It's sort of either a sort of amorphous mass or a set of possible elite defectors, but there's no actual actor called opposition organization. And so we've been trying to think about what we could leverage by spending more time thinking about the role of these seemingly weak organizations that always surprise us, right? And so the idea here is that since 2000 or 1999, we have been continuously surprised as a community. And we've been surprised by Putin's durability. We were surprised by United Russia's durability, which now looks to be here to stay. We were surprised by the protests. We were then surprised by Putin's resurgence. And I think we should be a little surprised by the electoral outcomes on Sunday, because they showed quite a remarkable range of outcomes within control that is seemingly not the kind of payoff you would expect for the control mechanisms that were exerted. And I call your attention to Kostroma, where, while it's true the Democratic Coalition didn't do well, United Russia didn't do all that particularly well either. So they got about 50% of the vote. There was clearly falsification, but Kostroma is a oblast where elections have been controlled since 1993. So that's not an actually such a surprising outcome. So what I want to say is that what we have seen is a trend of volatility, and we have a tendency as a community to look at leaders and apexes and say, oh, that's it. That's what's happening here, instead of saying, why are we bouncing so much? And I want to characterize, at least part of the problem is that we're too focused on moments of democratic breakthrough and not focused enough on lower level evolutionary patterns. So I want to talk a little bit about evolutionary patterns within the opposition, within the state control apparatus, which is what we're calling sort of the melding of this idea of menu of manipulation with also the authoritarian toolkit, right? So a broader set of things. And I want to argue that we're in a very odd moment where we're seeing at the same time an increase in opposition capacity to contest and also compete, at the same time that we're seeing an increase in state capacity to repress. And while there have, and what's to me a little bit puzzling about the outcomes, and I'm sure that Sunday's electoral outcomes, which were, after all, the dress rehearsal of the mechanisms of control, is that how far the shift in the control apparatus had been, and again, how startling it was that it wasn't as effective as we might think. So if we focus on keeping the democratic opposition out, yeah, it was effective. If we focus on the bigger picture, there's some very troubling signals, and I'm going to come back to that. So I'm focused on this evolutionary mechanism of change that links state and society, and I think that one thing we haven't thought a lot about, and which we are trying to think about in my book with Irina Sobolyova, is the legacy of protests for the elections and the legacy of elections for protests. That is the interaction between the two types of political behavior, right? So if we think back to 2011, we might characterize that parliamentary election not as an election because no one was actually competing for office, but as a protest. And it was a very effective protest. And from that, a social movement was born, albeit a relatively weakly institutionalized movement. And what's interesting about what was learned from that vote protest is that it wasn't the non-systemic opposition that said, oh, look how effective we were in mobilizing the vote protest, let's now turn it into a street action. It was these bloggers, right? So they sort of missed the fact that if you look at the story, they missed the fact that these people who went out and took this easy action of voting also might go out to the street, that there was a new cadre of people who might actually participate. And all these people needed to participate was a signal that other people were going to go out, and they would go out and join them. And one legacy of protest is the number of people willing to do that in large cities across Russia increased. And they are still there. And it'll be very interesting to see how many of them come out next week. And I'm sure other people have ideas about what that will look like. So we see in the data that we collected a core of protest stalwarts. And these were people who came out early and often, stayed out on the street, and really developed a movement identity. And they were also the same people who were mobilized by the Navalny campaign to implement the strategy that was developed in that campaign. So that was an important resource. There were also a set of people who had very different motivations for coming out, who were really just testing the waters. And these people were much harder to get out. They would come once or twice and not stay on the street. And these people were playing a sort of collective action game. They're easier to scare, they're easier to raise the costs of protest, and yet they share the same values as the people who went out early and often. That is, they're relatively coherent in their ideas, but they just have different motivations for being out. So that's one thing that we and other people learned about this. In response, both to the protest and to this unexpected success of the Navalny campaign, and I think the link between the two, the Kremlin renovated its control system in ways that are very obvious to us, right? Reliance on cultural symbolic politics. But the most interesting thing that they did, and I know we talk about this all the time, but I'd like to talk about it in a slightly different way, is that they did what Ed Schatz recommended, which was to shift the political agenda, right? So he argues that a major tool in the authoritarian toolkit is to revise the agenda. And one way in which that revision was very important, at least according to our data, was that we showed that rally participants, pro-Putin folks, and anti-Putin folks largely described the problems in Russia in the very same way. But the solution was different. For the protesters, the solution was reform of the system in an evolutionary way. For the Putin supporters, the solution was Putin. And that's also true of the non-protesters. So the non-protesters, people who didn't go to the street, also their solution was Putin. And Putin as the solution was not, as much as I kind of wanted it to be, this mythical figure of Putin. It was the effective manager version of Putin. So they thought that Putin, at least hopefully, would solve those problems. So as the economy goes down, things look a little chaos, less than stable at home, turning to a political agenda in which he now becomes the effective manager of national pride and international security, revitalizes that idea of Putin as manager, and I would argue is at least part of the reason that we see see an increase in ratings, very high increase in ratings. I want to just, again, refer to our data and say that it may not be entirely about controlled media. Yes, media is controlled. It was controlled in 2011 as well, fairly tightly. But what's interesting about what we see in our data is that people tend not to trust the media on domestic crises, but they do trust the media on international crises. So that the media has different weights. Sort of the propaganda over the media has different weights when you're talking about domestic and international sources. And so that I think is an important finding that speaks to some of this. So, and then on top of that, the regime adopts, in terms of elections, a very different and very tightly controlled apparatus. And we could talk more about that. Lots of other people in this room have quite a bit to say about that. Still, and here I'll move towards the end and let people talk about their data. In the election, we see a great deal of potential volatility. We see UR underperformance in some regions, in some places where they don't get to 50 or even in a few places 40%. We see some regions in which there are profound elite splits, so a sort of almost return to subterranean politics. Among the non-systemic opposition, one really interesting and I think potentially important effect of this rehearsal has been an increase in name recognition of both the actors and the organizations that are involved in the non-systemic opposition. So they may not have done well, and it would be interesting to explore how what the nature of affect goes along with name recognition. But name recognition went up, and that's a first step. That's an important first step. So even in Kostroma, you see increases in name recognition of some 20 points, according to some reputable polls that I've seen. Okay, so how do we know what's actually happening under the subterranean states? Well, it seems fairly clear that winning elections is not going to be possible. So then the opposition has to be creative in its response to protesting elections. So the strategy will have to move again, probably, if we want to prognosticate, from trying to compete to contest. And so that elections will once again become about the process of elections rather than trying to win office. And you did see a lot of this effort in the very localized city efforts that were happening in places where the Democratic Coalition was very active. Let me point out the big gap for the opposition right now. This is a political opposition. It's concerned with political problems. It articulates positions on corruption, about roads. It has yet to forge ties to economic interests and economic concerns. So if you want to know what might lead us to not be surprised about success in the next round, one big indicator would be that this movement would start to forge ties with economic oppositions and economic movements, which would bring them sort of more apparatus, more organizational space, but also would bring them much more support. That's it.
Much prefer to speak sitting down, but oh wow, you can hear me. I can hear me. Get this up on the screen, maybe. No. So, right. This what Graeme and I are going to present to you over the next however much time Henry gives us. Is an attempt at the culmination of something that Graeme and I have been working on for close to 3 years at this point, and that many of you will have seen presented, in some cases here, at George Washington, at Ponar's, at other conferences and workshops. This is really the first attempt, I think, to try to bring all of this into a cohesive, we hope coherent story, but we'll let you be the judges of that as the afternoon wears on. I think this is a story that in many ways speaks directly to some of the things that Regina's just been talking about. But also raises, I think, some additional questions that we need to be considering, right? So the story that we're trying to tell, or we think that our observations and our data are telling us as we pull it together, really, I think, comes in sort of these 3 points, one of which has 2 subpoints on the screen, right? One is that the regime's popularity, right? What we've seen in terms of whether it's the supposed 86% support of Putin, or the 2% support that, or the 90, whatever the inverse of the 2% support is, however you want to count, where the regime support lies in this weekend's elections and so on, is co-constituted. Right, that this is a process that does not begin and end with the regime going out and procuring a social effect, but that this is the process of a process that includes citizens, that we sometimes underestimate their level of activity in this process. Right, along with that, right, is, I think, our feeling that the legitimacy that's created in that process is very much situational. It's not inherent to the system, it's not inherent to Russia, but it's a reaction to a certain set of circumstances and stimuli which may change. Right? And that leads to the third part of the story, which is that this isn't forever. That there are challenges inherent in this to the regime in maintaining the factors of its own popularity, partly because, again, if it's not producing its popularity exclusively on its own, it is reliant on society to continue doing that, and that may become more difficult over time. We'll talk about why. But also what we think is the persistence of an opposition movement, right, which is something that we see as very distinct from opposition structures. And I think there's a conversation we'll need to have later about where that difference lies and what the real salient aspects of it are. And the question is not wanting to draw, not wanting to say that the movement, this oppositional movement that we see, and the opposition are the same thing. I think quite clearly they're not, right? One of the things that we start with, right, is a sense that the regime itself that we're dealing with in sort of the post-Bologna period is not the same regime that we went into this history with. It includes the same people in many cases, but it behaves and it looks and it feels and it acts differently. And one of the key stories in this is decreasing strength of technocratic claims on legitimacy, right? That this was throughout most of Putin's time in power, a government that could claim to be producing, or at least riding, a rising tide that was lifting all boats. It could claim to try to be all things to all people in the way that technocratic governments often do around the world, and thus to represent the interests of all people. As that technocratic claim, as economic performance and efficiency really began to falter late into Medvedev's presidency, we see an emergence of a challenge both within the elite and within society, of people not feeling so satisfied with how this is going. We see steadily decreasing approval ratings, and one of the things that seems to emerge in reaction is an increasingly dichotomous approach to politics, and us versus them construction of political competition, in which the regime starts to claim that it represents not everybody in society, but only those people who support it. And thus there are some group of people that will end up outside of that line. Right? The other thing is that the things that we've seen in recent years in terms of coercion, something that we can have a debate about whether we want to call it ideology, but the emergence of ideas and identities is more important in Russian politics, and this international confrontation that we see increasingly structuring the political discourse in Russia is not the product of the post-Crimea world. It is very much a product of a post-Bolotnaya world, but it certainly begins well before Crimea was a twinkle in Putin's eye, as it were. So, I won't run through a lot of observations on that. This is a story that I think is very familiar to all of you. But I want to do say something. I do want to say something about media and politics. Right. One of the things that we find is that there seems to be a very real kind of relationship. We'll talk about where this relationship comes from between the kind of media that people consume, right, and the views that they hold on certain issues that emerged in the post-Bologna period as wedge issues, as issues that again, we see this happen in other political contexts, including this political context, as issues that allow an incumbent to hive off certain parts of the constituency that may not hold the same ideas as their core constituents, right? So some of the things that emerged, for example, was this, after the Pussy Riot affair, this law on criminalizing offense of people's religious feelings, right? And what we find is that the distribution of opinion on this, from fully supporting to fully opposing, in the survey research that we did, and we'll talk more about the sampling later, is very closely related to whether or not people watch television. Right? Most people in Russia watch television. Even people who are using the internet are watching television. Right? But there is some portion of people who do not watch television. Right? And these people have very different, this is the red line here, right? Have a very different distribution of opinions. And in this case, they are about twice as likely to fully oppose this law as anybody else. Right? Same thing, more or less, on the law on propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations, if we use the full name, right? That we see, again, a very different curve of those people who do not watch television versus everybody else. Right? We don't see it so much when it comes to the question of whether Russia should take measures to deport most migrants. The survey was done right in the run-up to the Moscow mayoral elections, when Russia was taking measures to deport most migrants, or in any case, many thousands of them in Moscow and a couple of other places. And we do see some difference here, particularly in the degree of agreement, right? But we don't actually find anybody, regardless of whether they watch television, who disagrees with the idea that, or not many people who disagree with the idea that the rules on migration should be strengthened, right? But at least on those other two wedge issues, it does seem to play a very important role. The question, of course, is why. So we see that there's this close association between views and TV watching, but this is not the same thing as saying that television is producing this effect. Right? And one of the things that we know, both from our own research, but also is backed up by our research, but that we know from media theory and political theory in general, right, is that people select into their media usage based on things that they already feel and believe, and things that make them happy, and then they select out of it if it makes them uncomfortable, right? So we find sort of two communities of consumers of political information in Russia. One that seems to watch state television and reinforces positions that either it already held, or at least that the government then decided it wanted